Biscornu. It's a fun word to say, and it's an interesting family of shapes that you can use anywhere in your house. I'm Rebecca Kemp Brent. Let me show you how to take two squares and make a shape that has 8 corners. These are some simple biscornu, the kind we're going to talk about today, and you can see I have a variety of different fabrics. I have a fleece fabric, some quilter's cotton, and you can make a biscornu in almost any size. To make a simple biscornu, you just need 2 squares of fabric that are the same size. I'm starting out with 5-inch squares. They're a good size to start with, big enough but not too big, and also charm squares are pre-cut at 5 inches, so that's something you can do to get the fabrics that you want to use. I like to use 2 contrasting colors because that will accentuate the zigzag shape that you get around the edge of the biscornu. The first thing we need to do is take each of our squares and clip the midpoints of each side. And the simplest way to do that is just fold the square in half, take your scissors, and clip into the seam allowance. Now you can mark these first if you want to. After a while it's kind of easy to judge a 1/4 inch, and you want to make the clip as close to exactly your seam allowance width as you can, but definitely don't go over. So I'm going to cut almost a 1/4 inch into my seam allowance at the midpoint of each of the 4 sides. If you prefer to mark these ahead, that's okay. Or if you want to put both of your squares together and do them at the same time, you may be able to do that as well. Just remember, you can always make the clips longer if you need to, but you can't shorten them. So I've already marked the midpoint on my other square, and now we're ready to start sewing. I'm going to set my machine up with a slightly shorter than usual stitch length. I'm going to go to 2 millimeters, and that's because this is going to be stuffed, so I just want the stitches a little closer together. And although I'm using a straight stitch, I'm going to adjust the width of the stitch, which really moves the needle position. I'm using my regular all-purpose foot, and by putting the width at 5.5 millimeters on this machine, my needle is going to be a 1/4 inch from the edge of my foot. You want to measure that and be sure on your machine, but it's a great handy workaround if you need to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This machine also has a great function, the pivot function that I'm going to engage, and what that will do is at each corner it's going to raise the presser foot but leave the needle in the machine. That's really handy when you're going around corners, and since this project has 8 of them, I'm going to use that. I also need to get a pin. One of the tricks to sewing a biscornu is to think about it just 1 corner at a time. The shape can get complicated if you're trying to visualize the whole thing at once, especially when you're starting out. So we're just going to focus on 1 corner. I want to start by positioning the midpoint clip of my top square so that it is a 1/4 inch from the first corner of my bottom square. And I'm going to put a pin in it right at the clip. This is both holding the fabrics together, and it's also going to make it easier for me to see where that clip is as I sew to it. A lot of patterns for stuffed objects will have you leave an entire side open for stuffing. I like to actually stitch all of the corners in my project. It will leave a smaller opening but still usable. I just think it gives you tidier corners and makes things look a little more polished in the end. So I'm going to begin sewing just about a 1/2 inch before I get to this corner. So we'll lower the presser foot, and I do want to back stitch to take the stress when I turn and stuff this here in a minute. Now I'm going to sew exactly to my corner. Pull the pin out before you get there. You don't want to sew over your pin. And then when you lift the presser foot, reach underneath and you pivot so you're in position to sew the next side of your square. And you'll notice that my raw edges are now matched up again. The top fabric is folded a little bit, and this time The midpoint slash is underneath, but it's still going to be 1/4 of an inch before I get to my corners. So I'm going to put the pin in. That marks where I stop sewing. Now we lower the presser foot, and I'm going to sew right up to my pin again. This is one of those things that's a lot easier to do than it is to explain to you. When I come to that corner, I repeat the pivot, match up the raw edges. I'm going to continue all the way around my square. Another thing I like about this machine is that I can just bump the foot control and it will take one more stitch for me. That's another really handy function that you can check on your machine to see if you have that available. Just keep on. It seems to go on forever. At some point, about the 6th side, you usually think, what happened to that simple square I started with? But you just keep going, and now I just have one more corner that I need to work around. When I sew to this last corner, I'm going to repeat the pivot one last time. Don't even have to pin this time because we started that partial side at the beginning. So I just take a few stitches and then back stitch. And all the stitching on my biscornu is complete. So we've taken those two squares and made them into this really interesting shape. Now you turn this right side out through the opening that you left in the seam allowances. And again, this leaves a pretty small opening. You can leave the entire side open if you prefer, but I like to get those corners stitched if possible. Then you stuff this, stitch it closed with a few hand stitches. I like to stuff these with a clustered stuffing, a fiber fill that stays in clusters because it gives you this nice, soft, sort of smushy feeling. I think that's the technical term. If you want a firmer appearance, a firmer feel, you can use scraps of batting or you can use fiber fill, but you also can use reptile bedding, which is shredded walnut shells. That will give you a sort of heft to your product. It's great for pin cushions. It can even help to keep your pins sharpened. After you try these basic biscornu and gotten the hang of it, you may want to experiment with the ones that have 12 or even 15 sides. And you can also consider, as another technique, stitching a button through the center of your biscornu to give it this dimpled appearance. If you do that, you're going to need to have a really long needle. This is a doll making needle. And you can also use covered buttons that have a little bit of extra design to them, just as another feature for your biscornu. So I hope you'll enjoy adding biscornu to your vocabulary and maybe make a few to use around your house.